In The Lord of the Rings, the elves provide the Fellowship with what can only be described as an epic packed lunch. The freshly formed band of adventurers is given Lembas bread, thin cakes wrapped in leaves. Lembas bread is a bread only the Eldar know how to make. No, don't worry, not those Eldar, these Eldar. Lembas bread, also called waybread, isn't just any bread. Not only is it more pleasant than any bread made by men, that's men with a capital M, it provides one with the strength to work or march for a whole day. And as long as it remains unbroken and in its leaf wrappings, it does not go off. J.R.R. Tolkien, the creator of the Lord of the Rings universe, borrowed heavily from history and his own past for many elements in his stories. So today we're going to have a look at where he got the inspiration and ideas for his super bread. Then we'll end by making what we think is the closest real-world equivalent. Wait, are you saying there's like a real historical equivalent of Lembas bread? Yes, well, maybe. Sort of. Kinda. Was there, in reality, a bread so nutritious that a small piece could provide enough sustenance so that a grown man could work or march for a full day? No. Oh. If there had been, history would have been very different. Also, are you still here? Yes. As it turns out, I was quite popular. So I am now a recurring character. This is going to wreak havoc on my psyche. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah. So there might not have been magical bread that sustained you for a whole day's work, but there were plenty of candidates for the other qualities attributed to Lembas bread. As you might have guessed, the bread and its properties are a bit of a mixture of elements from Tolkien's past and personality. After all, mixing influences is a core part of his style. First up is Tolkien's religion. He was a devout Christian, and Lembas bread does have a striking resemblance to the Old Testament's manna. Oh, you mean like a magic meter, you know, the stuff you use for casting spells? Not really. Manna is the nourishing substance that descended from the heavens to feed the Hebrews on their 40-year journey through the desert, as told in the book of Exodus. There is extensive debate about what this could have been or what it was inspired by, ranging from things like honeydew resin to bdellium. What's interesting is that after Tolkien's death, his son gathered all his unpublished writings and little scribbles and compiled Tolkien's Legendarium, an encyclopedia of sorts of all the stuff that didn't make it into the encyclopedia that is already the Silmarillion. Damn, that man wrote a lot. In one of these scribbles, Lembas bread is described as the food given by Valar to the elves to sustain them on their great journey from Middle-earth to the Blessed Realm, which all feels very Exodus-y. Is that a word? It is now. That being said, Tolkien himself never explicitly compared Lembas bread to manna, and the comparison only goes so far. However, a much stronger candidate as an inspiration for the Fellowship's Mary Sue wafers is Holy Communion. The effects of Lembas bread aren't limited to just feeling well fed for a day and having the energy to march or work. It also gives hope. And in the words of Merry and Pippin, they put heart into you. For a very devout Catholic, which Tolkien was, communion or taking the Eucharist would have been a very important ritual. In The Lord of the Rings, Lembas can only be eaten by those who need it and have the heart for it. This is another strong similarity between Holy Communion and Lembas bread, namely its denial to those who have fallen from grace. One of the punishments the Catholic Church has, this is still a thing, is excommunication, where one is denied the sacraments. In the stories of Middle-earth, we see this reflected in how Gollum, famously a fallen hobbit, cannot eat Lembas bread. To quote directly from the book, Gollum sniffed at the leaf and his face changed. A spasm of disgust came over it, and a hint of his old malice. Smeagol smells it! Dropping the leaf, he took a corner of the Lembas bread and nibbled it. He spat and a fit of coughing shook him. Oh, is it because he's a murderer? As we see it in the story, Gollum represents he who has fallen to corrupting influences. In doing so, he has, so to speak, excommunicated himself. I don't know, this is all sounding very constructed. Methinks the man in tweed does cherry-pick too much. You are wise to be skeptical, and yes, Tolkien was indeed relatively subtle about his religious influence, unlike some of his friends and contemporaries. But in this, he himself admitted the link. Wait, he himself admitted it? Yeah. Although he does say that at the time of writing, he probably wasn't aware of it himself. In one of his letters, he wrote, "I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact, a Roman Catholic." The latter fact, perhaps, cannot be deduced, though one critic, by letter, asserted that the invocations of Elbereth and the character of Galadriel, as directly described all through the words of Gimli and Sam, were clearly related to Catholic devotion to Mary. Another saw in waybread, that being Lembas, the viaticum, and the reference to its feeding the will and being more potent when fasting, a derivation from the Eucharist. Ooh. So it appears he wasn't aware until a critic wrote to him saying, "Hey there, John Ronald Reuel, your Catholic is showing." What is even more interesting is that Lembas or waybread isn't just inspired by the Eucharist in general, but by the Viaticum, a very specific Eucharist. Viaticum or Viaticum was originally the term for provisions given to Roman soldiers for on the way while marching. Waybread makes sense. However, in Catholic sacraments, the Viaticum is the last Eucharist given to a dying person. Sustenance to help you on your way out. You can say that the entire journey to Mordor might be Frodo's journey to the afterlife. He goes to what is, in essence, hell, and in the end he is taken along with the elves to what is, again, in essence, heaven. There. That ought to keep discussion in the comments going for a couple of weeks. Yeah, sure. Just hang on a second here. I have to explain here quite urgently why the eagles cannot carry the fellowship to Mordor. With regards to the word Lembas, we're not 100% certain. But we think it comes from Lammastide, a mass done in both Protestant and Catholic denominations here in Britain, which actually originated with the Anglo-Saxons. Today it's also just called Loaf Mass, it being the Eucharist on the 1st of August, made with the year's first harvest of wheat. People these days. Huh? I'm pretty sure this guy doesn't even know who Tom Bombadil is. Sure. If you want to try Lembas bread for yourself, without necessarily becoming a Catholic, well, you could do that of course, but if you've got commitment issues, here is a less binding option. Catholic wafers are supposed to evoke the bread eaten at the Last Supper. Therefore, canon law prescribes that they contain no fat or leavening, just water and flour. Whether the bread at the Last Supper was actually like this is a different matter for a different video. Plenty of Christian denominations use various types of bread, but we want to taste Tolkien's wafers, so we're sticking to the Catholic formula. The easiest way to experience them is to just buy them. Don't worry, this is not disrespectful in any way. These are just wafers. They haven't gone through any rites of transubstantiation or have been blessed in any specific way. It's only once these go through the rites that they become a reserved sacrament. So even to the most devout Catholic, these are just flour and water, which anyone can have. Think of them as very bland crackers. If you want to make them for yourself and have them a bit bigger so they resemble the Fellowship's Lembas bread a bit more, you'll need a heated press. We don't have one of those, and you probably don't have one of these either. However, we do have one of these. It's not as silly as it looks. Waffles historically started when communion wafer mold makers, that's a mouthful, started getting creative. That's a video we've been brewing on for years by now. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it when it eventually comes out. But it's not a coincidence that the words waffle and wafer resemble each other. Therefore, using a waffle iron isn't that silly. Another thing that will probably do the trick is a heated tortilla press. We don't have one of those, but if you do and you try this, let us know how it worked out in the comments. So to make altar bread in accordance with Canon law, simply mix 1 part plain wheat flour with 1 part water. Here we're using 100 grams of just plain wheat flour and 100 milliliters of water. You want it to be a batter but a dry one because they need to break easily when ready. Now, press tightly in the iron and there you go. Pre-ritual communion wafers. We couldn't get ours as dry, probably because our waffle iron isn't as flat as the proper press. But as a proxy, we think they're all right. If they stick to the roof of your mouth, you've made them correctly. The wafers appeal, both homemade and bought, does come from these spiritual aspects because you don't eat these for the flavor. Being based on Holy Communion explains where devout Catholic Tolkien got the purifying and hope-giving natures of Lembas bread. It might not be the tastiest snack, but we think these would be a nice addition to anyone doing a Fellowship of the Ring cosplay or as a jokey snack for a Middle-earth themed party or game night. Just if you want to make friends, have some normal crisps ready as well. Which brings us to the aspect of Lembas bread we're still missing. For all of the spiritual benefits ascribed to the Eucharist, nowhere that we know of in Catholic canon or writings does it say that it gives energy to work or march, or that it tastes nice. It having no salt or flavorings being sort of the point. So, what else could have inspired this more down to Middle Earth aspect of waybread? We should point out that from here on we enter the realm of speculation, but bear with us, because this is quite fun speculation. Just remember to add a little bit more salt than was present in the communion wafers. When we have a cursory glance at Tolkien's personal history, his service as a lieutenant in the First World War stands out. And one can argue that a lot of his inspiration for Lord of the Rings came from there. The first candidate for Lembas bread is the tinned rations given to soldiers. Tinning or canning wasn't new, but in World War I, the production reached literal industrial scales. Canned food shares some traits with Lembas bread, most notably that it will stay good as long as it stays in its container. The leaves, being a reference to a pre-mechanical world, as mentioned in some of Tolkien's letters, are a potential stand-in for the tin. But the tin meals weren't specifically wholesome or popular. Also, they contain things like stew, not wafers. The other candidate, which is sometimes cited as being Tolkien's inspiration, is the Hundley and Palmer No. 4, a sugar-free hard biscuit which admittedly doesn't go off as long as you keep it dry. They weren't known to be sweet and pleasant, but they were nutritious and you could call them a wafer if you squint. We're not going to make what is essentially another form of hardtack. There are tons of videos out there of people making this and then struggling to bite or chew them. That's why we are going for something nicer. More in line with what Tolkien wanted Lembas bread to be. We found quite a few mentions of soldiers being sent shortbread from home during the Great War. Shortbread? Really? What's that? A biscuit that is famously pretty easy to make and tastes quite nice. Awfully convenient. Worst history video ever. Oh, come on. We are investigating the imagination of the man who arguably invented the fantasy genre. It's not that serious. And don't worry, there's very good reason for this. In 1892, not that long before the Great War, the Reverend James MacGregor wrote this about the state of communion in some parts of Scotland. I'm going to do the accent. It will be seen that even in the administration of the sacraments, the most solemn of all the functions of the Christian ministry, there was no uniform custom as to the mode, the time, or the frequency of the observance. Even in the episcopal times, there was no uniformity even in the elements, unless that in some form or other they were always bread and wine. Grey bread and shortbread, as well as white bread, have been in use, and claret as well as port. Oh, how? I know. And this was proper shortbread. One minister even described them as petticoat tails, which would be sweet shortbread biscuits. So you can see how shortbread is a delightful real-world placeholder for fantasy Lembas bread. Because we can imagine plenty of soldiers opening up their parcels from home, tired of chewing on hardtack for days, and then getting a nice slice of shortbread. Yes, that would be wholesome and give you some heart. So for this we are going to use a shortbread recipe from Mary Malcolm Palmer Douglas's recipe book, a handwritten manuscript dating from the late 19th century held at the National Library of Scotland. She provides us with the following shortbread recipe. 3/4 pound of flour, that's 340 grams of flour, 225 grams of butter and 150 grams of sugar, half a vanilla bean and half the rind of a lemon grated, or as we call it these days, zest. Mix well together. We recommend mixing the butter and the sugar first and then adding the flour and aromatics. Just easier but not crucial. If it's mixed, it's mixed. Roll out to the desired thickness. We recommend about 1/2 centimeter. And then, in Mary's words, cut into rings, hearts, or any fancy shape. We have some fancy shapes right here. Then bake for about 20 to 25 minutes at 180 degrees Celsius, depending on how thick you've made them. And there you have what we think Tolkien was thinking of when he wrote about Lembas bread. We can't speak for its spiritual qualities, but we do know that Tolkien would not have hated this. He confessed in one of his letters that one of his favorite treats was a small glass of port, port being a fortified wine like the ones used in communion, with a dry biscuit. Could have been a digestive or any other biscuit, but might as well have been some shortbread. Tad on the sweet side for us, not our favorite accompaniment, but could be a lot worse. Pretty nice. Also, Tolkien writes that he would not have this combination after dinner, like most people in his position. He was a lecturer at Oxford and port is a bit of a staple at the end of an institutional dinner, like high table. He preferred to have his port and biscuit mid-morning. And to me at least, drinking fortified wine in the morning is awfully reminiscent of the Eucharist. Or a drinking problem. Yeah, alright. I like to think of it as a little private communion. It might not help you commune with God, but maybe, just maybe, with your inner fantasy writer. Also, we put some of the shortbread dough in our waffle press and genuinely think that Tolkien would have been quite fond of these. So, for those cosplays and parties, you might want to go with this compromise. We hope you enjoyed this short exploration of Tolkien's personal history and its effects on one of the world's most popular stories. Please consider subscribing, or if you're already a subscriber, leaving us a like. It really helps us out. Thank you very much for watching.